Something happened on October 14th, 2025, that Microsoft never wanted you to notice. Not a press conference, not a headline, a quiet, invisible moment when millions of ordinary people sat in front of their perfectly working computers, received a single notification from Microsoft, and made a decision that a $1 trillion company had spent decades making impossible. They chose to leave. Not to a rival billion-dollar corporation, not to Apple. They left to something free, something built by two brothers in Dublin, something called Zorin OS. And within weeks, the numbers began telling a story Microsoft cannot spin, cannot buy, and cannot stop. There is a number that Microsoft does not want trending. It is not a stock price. It is not a quarterly earnings figure. It is not the user count of some obscure software tool buried deep in a tech forum. The number is 3 million. That is how many times Zorin OS, a Linux-based operating system built by a small company, not a tech empire, has been downloaded since October 2025. And the detail buried inside that number is the part that changes everything. More than 3/4 of those downloads came directly from Windows machines. Think about what that means. These were not Linux enthusiasts looking for their next distro. These were not developers experimenting with an open source kernel. These were everyday people, office workers, students, retirees, small business owners, sitting at their Windows computers, downloading something else entirely. That is not curiosity. That is defection. But here's where it gets interesting. This did not happen randomly. This did not happen because Zorin OS suddenly became cooler or because some influencer made it go viral overnight. This happened because Microsoft made a decision, a calculated, deliberate, business-first decision that quietly cornered hundreds of millions of its own users into an impossible situation. And when people are cornered, they do not always obey. Sometimes they walk out the door. To understand what happened, you need to go back to 2021, when Microsoft announced Windows 11. On the surface, it looked like a standard upgrade, a new design, new features, a cleaner interface. Normal. But buried inside the system requirements was something that was anything but normal. Microsoft mandated a TPM2, zero chip, a processor from Intel's 8th generation, or AMD's Ryzen 2000 series, or newer, at least 4 GB of RAM, and 64 GB of storage. For many newer machines, this was fine. For hundreds of millions of older computers, machines that ran perfectly well, that could browse the web, run spreadsheets, handle video calls, do virtually everything a modern user needs, it was a death sentence. Not because those machines stopped working, because Microsoft decided they were no longer worthy. Ars Canalis estimated that 240 million PCs could end up in landfills as a result of the Windows 10 end-of-life transition. Read that again. 240 million fully functional computers threatened with digital obsolescence not because they had broken down, not because they could no longer run software, but because a corporation in Redmond, Washington decided that its hardware gatekeeping policy mattered more than the machines people already owned. Environmental advocates called it planned obsolescence. Right to repair advocates called it corporate coercion. Ordinary users called it something far less polite. And Microsoft's response to all of this? For the first time ever, the company offered consumers an option to pay for extended support for Windows 10 for an extra year, through to October 2026, at a cost of $30 per device. That was the compromise, not flexibility. Not a lighter version of Windows 11 for older hardware. Not a path forward for the millions being left behind. A paid subscription to security patches on an operating system they already owned. This is the kind of decision that does not just frustrate users. It radicalizes them, but here's where everything changes. Because while Microsoft was building walls, someone else was building a door. Zorin OS 18 launched on October 14th, 2025, the exact same day Microsoft ended mainstream Windows 10 support. That timing was not accidental. This was a deliberate, strategically timed entrance into the biggest moment of vulnerability Microsoft had created for itself in years. The Zorin Group, founded by brothers Artyom and Kirill Zorin in Dublin, had been watching this scenario develop for years. They saw the wall being built, they saw the users being cornered, and they built their operating system to be the answer to a question Microsoft had forced millions of people to ask: what do I do now? What they built was not a typical Linux distribution. And this is the part that most people are not seeing. When the average person thinks of Linux, they picture a black terminal screen, cryptic command line instructions, and a steep learning curve that demands hours of tutorials before you can even connect to Wi-Fi. That image, while outdated, is still the psychological barrier that has kept Linux in the enthusiast lane for decades. Zorin OS was engineered specifically to destroy that barrier. Zorin OS is built on Ubuntu, which itself is based on Debian Linux, providing access to vast software repositories and ensuring broad hardware compatibility. But what sits on top of that foundation is something far more psychologically sophisticated than most Linux distributions dare to attempt: The Zorin OS team described their OS as designed to be the perfect Windows replacement for everyday users, professionals, and everyone in between. These are not empty marketing words. The design decisions embedded into Zorin OS 18 reflect a deep understanding of what actually scares people away from switching operating systems. It is not the software, it is the feeling of being lost. The disorientation of opening a machine and not knowing where anything is, the muscle memory developed over years of Windows use suddenly becoming useless. Zorin OS was built to preserve that muscle memory rather than erase it. Out of the box, the interface features a familiar start menu, a taskbar in the expected position, and a desktop environment that Windows users can navigate instinctively from the first minute. But the genius goes deeper than aesthetics. Zorin OS includes a feature called Windows App Support that can easily install XA or MSI files as if they are native applications, using wine compatibility technology that allows Windows programs to run inside Linux. This means a user arriving from Windows does not have to immediately abandon their entire software library. They do not have to relearn every tool they have used for years. They can bring pieces of their old world with them while they adjust to the new one. All of their data over to Linux. Think about the psychological weight of that decision. One of the most powerful reasons people stay locked into the Microsoft ecosystem is not Windows itself. It is and then there's the detail that might be the single most strategically intelligent feature in Zorin OS 18. The OS added full OneDrive functionality to allow Windows users to more easily migrate IR data, their documents, their photos, their files, all stored in OneDrive, all deeply integrated into the Microsoft cloud. By supporting OneDrive natively, Zorin OS 18 cut the last significant cord tying cautious switchers to Microsoft. You can leave Windows and still access everything you built inside it. That is not just a technical feature, that is an evacuation plan. The numbers that followed were, by any measure, extraordinary. Zorin OS 18 achieved a record-breaking 1 million downloads within just over a month since its release, breaking all previous records, with over 78% of those downloads coming from Windows users. 1 million downloads in 5 weeks from a small Irish company with no billion-dollar marketing budget, no celebrity endorsements, no Super Bowl commercial. Just a better answer to a problem Microsoft created, but the story does not stop there. It accelerates. By January 2026, Zorin OS 18 had crossed the 2 million download milestone in under 3 months, with more than 3/4 of those downloads coming from Windows machines, making that roughly 5 million downloads from people inside Microsoft's ecosystem. Windows Central, one of the most respected Microsoft-focused publications in the technology world, described it as one of Linux's biggest growth stories in 2026. When Microsoft's own fan base is covering the exodus with that kind of language, something fundamental has shifted. But here's where it gets worse for Microsoft, because the story was not finished. By April 2026, when the Zorin team released Zorin OS 18, the total download count for the Zorin OS 18 family had already reached 3 million in 6 months. From a free open source operating system, built by a company with a fraction of the resources of the organizations it is displacing. This is not a niche phenomenon. This is a measurable, documented, accelerating migration away from the world's most dominant desktop operating system platform. Now, the skeptic in you might be raising a reasonable objection. Downloads are not the same as installations. Installations are not the same as daily usage, and daily usage does not automatically mean permanent conversion. These are fair points, and the data itself is honest about them. It is worth noting that the statistics are purely based on downloads, and there is no precise data on how many of those downloads turned into full installations, or how many of those users stayed with Zorin OS as their daily driver after day one. This is true, but consider what the alternative interpretation reveals. Even if only a fraction of those 3 million downloads converted to permanent users, that still represents a migration of Linux adoption at a scale not seen before. And the people who downloaded it, even those who tried it and returned to Windows, now know something they did not know before. They know Linux works. They know it is not terrifying. They know the door exists. And that knowledge does not disappear. What most people are not seeing is the compounding psychological effect of this moment. Every person who successfully made the switch becomes a story. They tell their coworker. They help their parent set up their old laptop with Zorin instead of throwing it away. They post in a forum, write a review, make a video. The organic spread of "I switched and it actually works" testimonials is a marketing force that no advertising budget can replicate, because it carries the weight of genuine human experience rather than corporate messaging. A February 2026 thread on Hacker News titled "2026 will be my year of the Linux desktop" received serious, genuine discussion, rather than the usual ironic dismissal that has historically met Linux optimism. The culture has changed. The conversation has changed, and the numbers are changing with it. Consider also the technical ground Zorin OS 18 has covered that previous Linux distributions never fully addressed. Zorin OS 18 features a beautifully redesigned desktop with tastefully rounded corners, a floating panel by default, and a lighter, more inviting color palette, while core applications like Files, Calendar, Settings, and a new camera app have all been updated to match a fresh, cohesive look, making the entire system feel polished and modern. This matters more than technical users appreciate, because for the average person leaving Windows, the visual experience is not cosmetic. It is the primary signal of whether the system feels trustworthy and professional. Zorin OS 18 looks like an operating system designed by people who cared. That impression matters enormously to the users. Microsoft has been alienating. Multitasking has been made more intuitive with a new built-in window tiling manager. Simply drag a window to the top of the screen and a pop-up appears, offering predefined layouts to arrange windows efficiently without requiring complex keyboard shortcuts. For users arriving from Windows 11, this is the kind of feature that makes them raise their eyebrows. Because Windows 11 has snap layouts too, but they are buried behind a hover interaction that many users never discover. Zorin OS 18 makes it immediate and visual. It is a small detail, but it represents a philosophy. This is an operating system designed to be found, not discovered. The software ecosystem question, historically Linux's most vulnerable point, has also been addressed with increasing effectiveness. Linux distributions like Zorin have grown by including the ability to install progressive web apps out of the box, allowing users to run tools like Microsoft Office, Google Drive, Grammarly, and any other online service as a web app. In a world where the majority of daily computing work happens inside a browser, email, documents, spreadsheets, communication tools, the argument that Linux lacks the software people need has grown significantly weaker. The web is the new application layer, and Linux runs the web just as well as Windows does. Zorin OS 18. 1. Released in April 2026, expanded its built-in database to detect installer files for popular Windows apps by more than 40%, now supporting over 240 apps that users can use instead of attempting to install their original Windows executables. This means that when a new Zorin OS user downloads the installer for an application they used on Windows, something like Plex or a media player or a productivity tool, Zorin OS does not simply fail with an error. It analyzes the installer, recognizes what the user is trying to do, and directs them to the best way to get that application running on their system. This is not just compatibility, this is guided migration. And it is the kind of thoughtfulness that turns a cautious experimenter into a committed convert. Zorin OS 18. 1 also runs on kernel 6. 17 bring better driver support, including for gaming handhelds, a signal that the platform is not just targeting Office users leaving Windows, but also the gaming community that has historically been the most reluctant to make the jump. The gaming barrier on Linux has been collapsing for years, driven largely by Valve's Proton compatibility layer that allows Windows games to run on Linux through Steam. Zorin OS integrates with this ecosystem directly, meaning users can install Steam and access thousands of games without leaving the platform. For the younger generation of users who have grown up gaming on Windows, this is no small thing. It removes the last major lifestyle barrier. Now step back and look at the larger picture, because what is happening here is not simply a product gaining market share. What is happening is a structural shift in the relationship between users and the corporations that build their operating systems. For decades, Microsoft has operated from a position of near total dominance in the personal computing market. Windows runs on roughly 70 to 75% of all desktop computers worldwide. That dominance was sustained not purely through the quality of Windows, but through inertia, the sheer weight of habit, compatibility, familiarity, and the absence of viable alternatives that ordinary people could actually use. That inertia is now being disrupted by the very company that created it. Microsoft's TPM2, zero requirement, its mandatory Microsoft account integration in Windows 11, its push toward AI-driven advertising through Copilot, its decision to embed ads into the Start menu, its data collection practices. Each of these individually might have been forgiven, tolerated, absorbed as the cost of using the world's most familiar operating system. But together, they formed a cumulative weight that finally became too much for a measurable number of people. And Zorin OS was ready when they arrived. What informed observers are tracking closely right now is not just whether Zorin OS continues to grow, but whether this moment triggers a broader platform shift across the Linux ecosystem. Because Zorin OS is not the only distribution experiencing growth. Ubuntu, Linux Mint, Fedora, Pop. Among OS, all of these platforms have seen heightened interest since October 2025. But Zorin OS has emerged as the face of this migration, the distribution most perfectly engineered for the moment Microsoft created. Its success is both a product of timing and of deliberate design, And those two things together represent something that is very difficult to replicate or counter. The hardware industry is watching as well. For years, PC manufacturers have built their roadmaps around Microsoft's requirements. The TPM2 zero mandate, for example, shaped which components motherboard manufacturers prioritized. The Windows certification program influenced what hardware received driver support. But if a meaningful percentage of the PC buying market begins purchasing devices specifically for Linux compatibility, or begins extending the life of older machines with Zorin OS instead of replacing them, the calculus for hardware manufacturers begins to shift. PC manufacturers long aligned with Microsoft might see demand for Linux pre-installed devices if the trend persists, and Intel and AMD, whose processors power most PCs, have improved Linux support in recent years, making switches smoother. And then there's the enterprise dimension, which is where the real long-term stakes live. Microsoft's dominance in enterprise environments has always been its most durable fortress. Corporate IT departments standardized on Windows, Active Directory, Microsoft 365, Azure, and Teams, creating an ecosystem of interdependence that was genuinely difficult and expensive to exit. But the security concerns around Windows 11's aggressive data collection, the increased costs of licensing, and the growing maturity of Linux-based enterprise solutions have begun introducing cracks into that fortress as well. If Zorin OS and distributions like it continue to demonstrate that Linux can be mainstream, that ordinary non-technical users can adopt it without significant friction, the argument against enterprise Linux adoption becomes harder to sustain. The deeper question lurking beneath all of this is one that nobody in the mainstream technology press is asking directly. And it is this: has Microsoft's strategy of treating its own user base as a captive market finally met its natural limit? For years, the company's playbook relied on the assumption that users would absorb whatever friction Microsoft introduced. New requirements, new costs, new features they did not ask for, because the alternative was too difficult. That assumption may no longer be correct. The alternative is no longer difficult. The alternative is a free operating system that looks like Windows, runs like Windows, supports your files and many of your applications, and does not require you to buy new hardware or pay a subscription fee to keep your computer secure. It would appear that the year of the mainstream Linux desktop may be upon us, and poetically, it is Microsoft's own doing. But here is what makes this moment genuinely uncertain, rather than a simple victory narrative. The question of retention, of whether the people who downloaded Zorin OS actually stay, remains open. Switching an operating system is one of the most psychologically significant technology decisions a person can make. Habits are deep. Compatibility gaps, however small, can be deal breakers in professional environments. And Microsoft, despite its missteps, is not standing still. The company has the resources, the engineering talent, and the market position to respond to competitive pressure in ways that a small Irish company cannot easily anticipate or counter. Microsoft has already quietly reversed some of its most controversial decisions, eventually loosening its once absolute TPM2. Zero requirement after months of claiming it was non-negotiable. This kind of reversal, which on the surface looks like a concession, is actually a competitive weapon. It signals that when users push back hard enough, Microsoft will respond. And that responsiveness, even if it arrives late, even if it is incomplete, can be enough to slow the momentum of an exodus. Users who might have been on the edge of switching may now reconsider if the primary friction point has been partially removed. The more unsettling scenario for the Linux ecosystem is this: what if Microsoft's pivot toward AI computing actually succeeds in creating a compelling value proposition that Linux cannot match? The Copilot Plus PC initiative, the deep integration of AI assistants into Windows workflows, the seamless connectivity between Windows devices, Microsoft 365, and Azure cloud infrastructure. These are capabilities that Zorin OS, for all its excellence in the migration experience, does not yet replicate in depth. If the next generation of computing is defined by AI native workflows, and Microsoft builds that layer more effectively than anyone else, the appeal of the familiar interface may evolve into something Zorin OS cannot mimic as easily as a taskbar or a start menu. Yet even that scenario carries a warning for Microsoft, because the users who left in 2025 and 2026 did not leave out of curiosity. They left out of anger, out of a sense of betrayal. Posts from tech communities reflected a growing sentiment of disillusionment with Microsoft, pointing to features in Windows 11 like mandatory Microsoft accounts and AI-driven ads, framing the shift as a rebellion against corporate overreach. Trust, once broken, does not repair itself with a better feature set. It requires a fundamentally different relationship between a company and the people it serves, and there is very little evidence that Microsoft has internalized that lesson, rather than simply managed the optics around it. What the 3 million downloads of Zorin OS represent, at their deepest level, is something more significant than a Linux distribution gaining popularity. They represent a moment in which ordinary people, not developers, not hackers, not ideological open source advocates, exercised genuine freedom of choice in a market where that freedom has historically been constrained by the very company that claimed to empower them. They represent millions of individual decisions to value control over convenience, to value longevity over upgrade cycles, to value an operating system built around their needs, rather than one that treats their attention and data as a monetizable asset. Whether that moment becomes a sustained movement or a statistical anomaly depends on questions that remain unanswered. Will the switchers stay? Will the hardware ecosystem respond? Will enterprise IT departments eventually follow consumer behavior, as they always ultimately do? Will Microsoft correct course deeply enough to win back the trust it has spent years eroding? And perhaps most importantly, will the next version of Zorin OS, the next breakthrough in Linux compatibility, the next wave of Windows-alienated users, push the numbers past the threshold where the mainstream technology industry can no longer describe what is happening as a niche phenomenon? The trajectory, right now, says something bigger is coming. The numbers say it, the culture says it, the timing says it. Something shifted on October 14th, 2025, when a trillion-dollar company ended support for the computers of hundreds of millions of people, and a small team in Dublin launched an operating system on the exact same day to catch them. That is not coincidence. That is not luck. That is a calculated bet that the moment Microsoft stopped listening, people would start looking. And right now, 3 million of them have already found the door. The only question left is how many are walking through it permanently, and what happens to the company that never thought they would.